Welcome back, everybody, and I hope you had a chance to recharge over the break. Now we're going to move to our keynote lecture of today, and I'm delighted to hand the floor to the facilitator for this session, who's Radek Urban. He's a board member here at the SRB and is also Director for Resolution Planning and Decisions at the Single Resolution Board. Radek.
Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had a very fruitful discussion over lunch. It was not easy to get you all back in time, but here we are. My name is Radek Urban, and I'm a board member here at the SRB. It's a great pleasure to introduce you to our keynote address and to our keynote speaker, Professor Thomas Philippon. Unfortunately, he cannot be with us today for personal reasons, but we are very happy that he was able to join us online. Professor Philippon is the Max L. Hein Professor of Finance at New York University, Stern School of Business, from 2003. He's one of the most respected economists of our time. He was named one of the top 25 economists under 45 by the IMF. He won the Bernays Prize for Best European Economists under 40, the prize for Best Young French Economist, and the Brattle Prize for the Best Paper in Corporate Finance. But he also has an extensive career advising on policy development, both in France and around the world. In France, he served as a member of the Conseil d'analyse économique of the French government, a board member of the French Prudential Authority, and a senior economic advisor to the French Finance Ministry. Outside of France, he was a member of the Financial Advisory Roundtable of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, an advisor to the Financial Stability Board, as well as to the Hong Kong Institute for Monetary and Finance Research. Now, Professor Philippon has studied various topics and published on various topics in macroeconomics and finance, including systemic risk and financial crises, dynamics of corporate investment and household debt, financial innovation and financial regulation, but also on Eurozone crisis and market powers of large firms. Now, today, he will discuss optimal design of financial regulation, including optimal intervention by public authorities. He will also discuss how to address bank-run problems and how to contain market discipline. In his recent papers, he focuses on the issue of too big to fail and the way how to address it by applying asymmetric treatment of banks. Let me now give the floor to Professor Philippon.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And I am terribly sorry I cannot be with you, but as was said, it's really out of my hand. I have a kid who needs to be taken care of a lot these days. So, and I see many familiar faces in the audience, so I wish I could be there to say hi. So I'm going to talk about the issue of resolution and deposit insurance in a framework that I think captures like modern issue in macroprudential risk management. And I have to say also that it's going to resonate, I think, quite well with the 4 papers that Antje, Matthew, Julien, and Thomas presented this morning. So you will see the connections. Okay, so the quick outline is I'll show you a quick framework to think about crisis resolution and various regulation, including stress testing, although today is not going to be the focus. And then I want to spend some time thinking about moral hazard. And I think that if you think about it correctly, some results are surprising. Or if you wish, there is a significant difference between the way we think about moral hazard today versus 20 years ago. And the one thing that I want to emphasize, that's going to be the main theme of this talk, is that there is a very strong link between the quality of micro-prudential tools on corrective actions, resolutions, living wills, and the quality of the macro-prudential regulation, as well as dealing with too big to fail. Okay. So I'll explain that, and then in the end, I'll talk about 2 challenges. There are many others we could discuss, but I think they are also connected to what we saw. One has to do with speed and segmentation, and the other one with market power and market discipline. Okay, so let's dive in. So first, what I think is the minimalist framework to think about these issues. It's very standard. I think the tension that we wish to analyze always, the tension between risk management or risk taking ex ante and ex post interventions and bailouts. So to think about it, you need essentially 2 by 2. So you need 2 periods and 2 states. Time zero is when we think about banks making risk management and investment choices. In particular, how much risk they want to take, how much risk they want to shift. Typically, in the literature, we think about most of the micro risk taking is some type of hidden leverage, which is either hidden in plain view, like Thomas was saying about the SVB case, or hidden off balance sheet. At the macro level, it's more about interaction with various markets, and usually, especially recently, it's been connected to shadow banking activities. And then the regulations are going to include solvency, liquidity regulation, as well as stress testing and the design of living wills and resolution plans. So this is all what we do at the beginning, or ex ante. And then most of the time, we don't need that stuff. Most of the time, we're in normal times, and there's no crisis, and banks make money. And that state, the normal time, is actually the one that motivates most of banks' action. Naturally, they think this is the most likely outcome, and that's where they spend most of their time, and that's where they make their money. And so they tend to make that decision based on what happens in normal times. Unfortunately, there's some chance that there's a crisis, a systemic crisis that triggers market failures, and because of market failures, triggers interventions. Now, what we would like is the bank to internalize what happened in a crisis when they make their risk management choices upfront. But that's where the trouble is. So it could be that there is like neglect of the risk of a crisis, so maybe they underestimate P, or it could be that they don't worry as much as they should about P because they anticipate government bailouts. Okay. And so when we think about neglected risk, I don't think there is necessarily like a gigantic difference between neglected risk and risk and moral hazard, in the sense that if your incentive is not to see something, you're not going to see it. And then you can always pretend it's because you couldn't see it as opposed to ignoring it. So to me, it's kind of one and the same. Now, the key thing is how the losses and bailouts allocation in crisis time feed back into risk taking and risk shifting at time zero. So can we design programs, both ex ante and ex post, that somehow manage to stabilize the system without creating bad incentives for everyone? Okay, so that's the challenge. Now, to understand the tension, first we need to understand this box. Once you're in a crisis, so in some sense it's too late, but once you're in a crisis, what are you going to do? And once we understand that, we'll be able to speak to the other issue. So assume now that you're in the bad box, in the crisis state. So regulators and policymakers are in crisis mode. And at that point, the question is just, what are the right tools to try to save the system? Okay. Well, the right tools depend on the failure you're trying to address. Okay. So we're going to discuss 3 market failures: runs, credit crunch / debt overhang, and market freeze. And then in each case, we're going to see what is the right tool to use to fight 1, 2, or 3. Now, the framework to think about it, though, I think that one we're all convinced is ex post welfare maximization, i.e. no commitment. So what it means, so that's the jargon of economists. What it means for policymakers is even if you had sworn all your gods at time zero that you would never, ever bail them out, if you end up in the box, you're going to do ex post whatever is necessary. And therefore, you're going to choose ex post. It doesn't mean you're going to waste money. It just means that ex post, you're going to do what's efficient ex post. Okay. So I think that's kind of, that no commitment view is the right one. So I take it as given. So in other words, I never assume that regulators, policymakers are able to commit to letting the economy burn down. Okay. First of all, I think it would be a bad idea. In any case, it's not realistic. Okay, so now let's look at 1, 2, 3. And so 1, bank runs. So I think the traditional answer is very clear. No need to go back to that. It's some form of deposit insurance. And to some extent, that's kind of old news and boring. But in recent years, I think there's 2 key issues that we need to think about. First, the issue of uninsured deposits. What do you do with these guys? In Europe, we had a very acute example of that in the case of Cyprus. But more recently, like the issue of uninsured deposit is front and center in how banks react to shocks. Actually, as Thomas explained also in the case of bank runs that happens recently, SVD and the bank runs in real time. So deposit insurance is great, but then there is an open question, and probably more acute than before, about what is the coverage. And that's true in the US just as much as in Europe. And then in Europe, to some extent, we have another issue, which is about the design of the EU level deposit insurance. And that's the issue of who shares, how we share the losses. And if a country doesn't have much fiscal space to avoid bank runs, then that can create lots of inefficiencies. It can interfere with many things that would be useful, such as good stress tests, like we saw in Spain. So I want to talk about that, but we'll come back to it when we have a better understanding of the framework. Okay, so remember, 1 was runs, 2 is the credit crunch. So credit crunch or debt overhang. This one I studied with Philip back in 2013. So this was actually purely motivated by what we saw post-Lehman Brothers. And again, the question we wanted to ask is, suppose you end up in a world where banks have too little equity, too much debt, and therefore they're going to cut lending. And you want to do something about it. Then what is the right tool to restart the lending market? Okay, so then what we solve is the program that's written here. So we minimize the cost to taxpayers. So we minimize the net present value of taxpayer transfer to banks, subject to getting some amount of welfare for the economy as a whole, which typically in this world, meaning you get more lending to the extent that without intervention lending is too low, you get more lending, and that improves welfare, provided the lending is in the right place. And probably it doesn't mean you need to go back to what would have been the first best. You just improve the situation. So we solved this problem for a general framework with debt overhang, and then we characterize the right way to intervene. And sometimes what's interesting is it's a bit like in Sherlock Holmes, the dog that didn't bark. What's interesting is the right tools, but also precisely the ones that are not the right tools. And what you'll see is that one tool that is conspicuously absent from this list is asset purchase. Okay, so in the case of debt overhang, it is efficient to recapitalize by injecting equity in the banks. So that is actually not super surprising given the market failure. Now, it is always better to do that than to try to buy back the bad assets. And then if you want to minimize cost to taxpayer, that is, you want to recoup some of the money without creating extra debt overhang. And also you want to avoid opportunistic participation so that firms or banks that could have lent by themselves don't participate in the program. Then the government wants to ask for a mixture of preferred stock and warrants in exchange for equity. So the optimal program is for the government to say, I'm going to inject equity in the bank, and against that equity, I will receive preferred stocks and warrants. If you do that, it's still costly. So this is not an intervention that is free, but it is the best you can do under the circumstances. Okay, so we talked about run, credit crunch. The third one is a market freeze, a market where assets are supposed to trade. Firms are supposed to get funding, and suddenly that market freezes. So again, the program we solve is the same as before. So you have a market failure. You want to improve welfare, and you want to minimize cost to taxpayer. So we characterize the entire Pareto frontier that minimizes the cost subject to getting some amount of welfare. Okay, so that's a framework of adverse selection. So it's kind of a traditional Lehman market applied to financial markets. And again, we ask, what is the right tool? Now, this one has a bit more meat to it in the sense that it was, at least to me, less clear up front exactly how the intervention would look like. And the reason is, the very old, at least well described issue of the signaling effect of participation in government programs. So banks don't like to borrow from the discount window because that makes them look bad and weak. In general, good banks don't like to ask for government money because, again, it's a bad signal. So now if you're in this world where everything you do is a signal, and the government has to think about not just how much it's going to spend, what tools they're going to use, but also how the market is going to interpret the outcome of the program. Okay? So you can think of it as you have a program, government are trying to design a program, again, to improve a market that has just frozen. So it has to find the right terms of the program. Like, what's the interest rate? What's the cap? How much can you borrow? How much? What kind of what securities do I get in exchange, and all of that? But it lives in a market where the private market is still out there. So you still have outside investors who decide to lend to banks. Okay? And they're going to lend in particular to some banks who stay outside the program and some banks who participate in the program. The problem is that the decision to participate is going to be interpreted as a signal. So these guys, the outside investors, are going to think, well, wait a minute. So who is joining the government program? Everybody? Only the good guys? Only the bad guys? So if you're in a world where only the bad guys go to the government and the good guys stay out, then lending to the non-participating bank becomes extremely attractive. in fact, the interest in that market is going to be very low because it's going to be positively selected. Okay, while the bad banks who decide to go in the government program are going to be perceived as bad apples, and therefore, if they get any money from outside, it's going to be very expensive. You might say, well, that's okay. It's okay, except that it's going to make it very unattractive to get banks to participate in the program, which means it's going to be intuitively, it could make it more costly for the government to implement a program, because since the program is a bad signal, if you want to make it attractive enough to get banks to participate, you're going to have to sweeten the deal, and that's going to make it expensive. So I think in that one, it's fair to say that it is not obvious how the solution would look like. And in fact, I thought it would be intractable. It would just be a nightmare and we wouldn't be able to say anything. It turns out, however, that the solution is very clear-cut, despite all of these complications. So that was kind of surprising. I guess it was surprising to me. I think for Tirol, it was not surprising. He understood it very quickly, but not me. Okay, so what is the right instrument? That's the first thing. So the optimal instrument turned out to be some type of debt guarantee or discount lending. And there's a deep reason for that, which is there's some sense in which the government, when it steps in a market that's failing, is subject to the same friction as the private market is. And so if the private market turns out that if private investors think the right way to fund the bank is, say, by short-term loans, because the private sector think that is the constrained, efficient way to do it, the same exact friction applying to the government are also going to imply that the right instrument for the government looks like the same instrument that was used in the first place in the market. In other words, because it's a debt market you're trying to unfreeze, you don't want to go there with equity. That actually doesn't help. So very different from the credit crunch we saw earlier. So that's the first point. So that's consistent, of course, with standard programs. So direct lending could be the central bank lending directly to the bank. Debt guarantees could be the Treasury or any other agency providing first loss coverage for investors who buy debt. All of that is part of the optimal package. Okay, the second thing is, in this world, how do we think about success? Okay. And the other thing that was interesting to me is that you want to assess, essentially the sufficient statistic to assess success is to see the impact on the market interest rate for the banks that do not participate. The size of the program actually turns out to be quite irrelevant. Not completely irrelevant. If the size is 0, you're going to do nothing. But you could have the same exact outcome for the economy, the same exact cost for the taxpayer, with a program size that varies by a factor of 10. As long as the impact on market prices, the funding cost of banks in the private market, as long as that interest rate is the same, all of these interventions are going to be equivalent. And that's it's a little bit intuitive when you think about it, is there is very many different ways of mixing good and bad banks on the left and on the right. If they give the same price in the green market, they're all equivalent. Therefore, it is not, you could have two countries and they design the same program, one end up having a massive program, the other one a smaller one. If they have the same price impact on the private market, they are about the same. And the last point that was also, to me, quite interesting is you don't need to restrict private markets. So even though there is this issue of signaling, you would not do better by shutting down the private market altogether. Okay, all right, so let's take stock of the first part, which is what are the tools to fight crisis once you're in a crisis? And I think the big picture there is, it turns out that the right tool for the government to step in always looks like the tools that the private sector is already using. And to some extent, it's quite intuitive. So that's why with against bank runs, you end up with something like a deposit insurance fund. That's why if you're dealing with a credit crunch, you end up injecting equity in exchange for preferred stocks and warrants. That's why if you have a market that's frozen because of adverse selection, you get in there with credit guarantees. So as I said earlier, the thing that's just as interesting as what's the right thing to do is what is not the right thing to do. And the right thing, to me, the striking thing is buying back bad assets is never a good idea. And the reason is because, well, the private sector doesn't do it in the first place. So if the private sector were to do it in the first place, so if there was a market for this bad asset, maybe the government could get in there. But if the private sector don't do it, it's because that's a bad idea. And therefore, it is valid to be a bad idea for the government as well. And now the bankers tend to ask for that precisely because it's a bad idea, precisely because they know that this will not be cost minimizing for taxpayers. So if bankers come and say, please buy back our crappy asset because that's a way to unfreeze the market, don't do it. Okay. So now that we understand a bit what are the right tools to fight crisis, then let's go back and think about this moral hazard issue. Okay, so I guess let's go back to my picture here. I want to think about this red arrow going back here. Okay. So the programs I've discussed, they are optimal ex post. Like we are trying to minimize cost to taxpayer. We are trying to minimize the amount of bailout. But the optimal action is not zero. If the world is in crisis, you want to do something. So you're going to spend some money there. That is bound to affect risk-taking incentive at time zero. So the question becomes, how bad is it? How much more hazard do you create by doing the right thing in a crisis? And there, I think there is a very strong, essentially, the old models are wrong, is my point. The first generation naive view give you the wrong answers. I'm going to illustrate with two critical questions. Okay, so say that anything the government does creates more hazard, all right? Well, then the implication is, well, just kill the government. So in this case, it just means create a situation where there's just no fiscal space at all for government exposed. Well, they can't spend money because they don't have any money. Okay? So if you really thought the big issue was more hazard created by the government, just take away the money, take away the purse. And that's going to solve everything. And in fact, the first generation model tell you exactly that. They say, yes, do that. And I think it's just completely wrong. Instead, you want to think about the right fiscal space to do the right thing ex post. So my view is, instead of thinking about reducing fiscal space for the size of funds you can use to fight the crisis ex post, you need commitment to for instance, stronger asset quality reviews and a backstop. And by doing so, you will do strictly better than by taking away the purse. Very related, actually, is the question of bailouts and too big to fail. So we all agree some form of bailout is unavoidable. If the banking system, the credit system, the financial system is collapsing, you're going to step in and you're going to do whatever it takes to put it back together. And they all know that. Therefore, they anticipate some time of bailout. Well, if that's if that's the way you think about it, then too big to fail becomes like a hopeless problem, right? There's no way you can commit not to bail out in terms of crisis. So therefore, there is no way you can avoid messing up the incentives of especially big banks. And again, that's exactly what the first generation model would say. And again, I think that's dead wrong. Instead, what you need to understand is the need for good micro prudential resolution tools. And once you have these tools, you can, in some case, have your cake and eat it too. which is you can fight crisis export while not messing up incentives upfront. So I'm cautiously optimistic in that sense. I'm going to explain now how this comes about. So the first one is actually very easy to illustrate, but it's related. These two are related in the sense that the naive model tended to look at problems one by one. They were looking always at one-dimensional issues. So if you have a one-dimensional issue, there's like a line. There's only one line you can move on. And so you either go up or you go down. That's it. It's boring. So in that world, if you don't want to go up, you go to zero, which is why they gave these strong answers. But as soon as you move in the world, the real world, where there's more than one dimension, these things is not true anymore. So the simplest one is, instead of thinking of runs and market freeze as being two issues that you study one by one, let's just put them together. Sounds like a very benign thing to do. But if you do that, you kill all the supposed answers of the first generation models. So that's what we do in the restart paper. So this is literally the standard model of bank run together with the standard model of market freeze. But as soon as you do that, you realize now that the government has two tools to use. The government, if you want to unfreeze the market, if you think the reason the market is frozen is because nobody knows who owns what, nobody knows the quality of the balance sheet, therefore nobody wants to lend to anybody, well, maybe disclosure is the right solution, right? Just run an asset quality review, publish the results, and now the market participant will have the information. They will be able to assess the risk and make the right lending decisions. Okay, so what's the trade-off? The problem is that only works if you actually give good information, give useful information. But precisely if you give useful information, sometimes it's going to be bad. And therefore, you're going to create a run on the weaker banks. So the trade-off is you could run a very aggressive, very truthful asset quality review. And that'd be wonderful for market discipline and market functioning. But you might, like the side effect is you might create massive runs on the banks that you have now identified as being weak. So what's the solution? Again, we do the same exact thing as always. We study what the right thing to do is. We try to minimize cost to taxpayer. And then as soon as you do that, you flip everything on its head. So rich governments typically do better. They do better in the sense of they avoid crisis and they avoid moral hazard. You might say, isn't that the exact opposite of what we saw here? And yeah, it is, because these models were wrong. So the intuition is, if you have fiscal space, it's like an insurance policy. So if you have fiscal space, you can be very truthful and very tough on your AQR. You just say, I'm gonna go in, check the balance sheet, and publish the result as is. I don't care if the results are bad. If you do that truthfully, it's going to be extremely efficient to restart the market. The problem is there is a risk. If it turns out that your AQR reveals that the system is really undercapitalized, or many banks are undercapitalized, you might create big runs. Okay. So now the question for the government is, should I take that chance? And the answer is yes, you will take that chance if you have a backstop, if you have the fiscal space. So in that case, having the fiscal space allow you to be more truthful, more forceful in your AQR, and that actually reduces bailouts. Okay. Therefore, the direct implication is if you reduce the government bailout options, you're actually going to increase moral hazard in that world. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is there is this view, again, there was the view that to first order, we can think of the amount the amount of moral hazard created as roughly proportional to the size of the bailout. Okay. Hey, the more you're going to take taxpayer money to give it to the banks, the more moral hazard you're going to create. Okay. That sounds pretty intuitive at that level. Okay. But if you think more clearly what it means the amount of money you're going to spend is a sufficient statistic for the distortion of incentives. And actually, that is not true. Okay, so that's the recent the huge paper with Olivier. And there we just point out one thing, which is to some extent, I mean, almost trivial when you say it, but incentives depend on who gets the money, as well as how much money there is. And there is nothing in the book that says that you have to bail out everybody equally. You can discriminate. And so imagine you have banks, A, B, C, D, E, and so that's their names. And then in some crisis state, they're going to be ranked from 1 to 5. 1 being the best and best performing, and 5 being the worst performing. Now, you don't know who's going to map into what. Like, you don't know if bank A is going to end up being bank 2 or 3 or 4. That depends on many things, risk, random stuff, as well as risk management. But suppose your policy is that you're going to save the system, so you're going to spend whatever the amount of money required to save the system, but you're going to bail out, or you're going to let the worst one fail, and then split the money among the remaining 4, or let the 2 worst one fail and split the money among the remaining 3. So in that world, every bank understands that they'd rather not be bank number 5. So at the margin, if they think, oh, I'm going to be the worst performing bank if something bad happened, I need to do something to get back to being at least not the worst one. Okay, great. But then the next bank is thinking the same. And the next one is thinking the same. So the whole moral hazard unravels. And you end up with every bank doing exactly the optimal amount of risk management, even though they all understand that there will be bailout money exposed. So that's the basic intuition. And then we formalize that to really understand what are the key features. And then we qualify, like, what is it exactly that you need for that positive result to be true. And it turns out that the key, so in a very, like in an abstract sense, the key is the degree of substitution between the banks. If exposed, the government perceives bank 1, 2, 3, 5 as being roughly equal substitute, a good substitute to each other, then really it doesn't really care which one it kills. If the government thinks, I need 3 banks or 4 banks to run my economy, but which one of the 5 I select doesn't matter, or which one I kill doesn't matter, as long as I keep 4. That's the best situation to be in as a regulator, because then it is as good as having full commitment. But that's true only if you perceive the banks as being substitutes. So let's think about what substitute means. So formally, the theorem is if they are good substitute, you get first best. Okay, so good substitute could mean very different things. It could mean that you can merge the banks without disruption. Okay. You can merge the bank and impose losses on shareholders of the bad bank efficiently. The banks, the flip side, I guess, when we to think about a case where the banks would not be good substitutes, is suppose you have 2 regions and the banks are fully local, then they are not good substitutes. Now, if you can get a bank from a first region to take over a bank in the other region, if that's feasible, then they become substitute again. Because substitute means you can impose losses on the shareholder of the bank without messing up their lending activities. So what's interesting there is we get two things that, again, are very much against the first generation view, but consistent with the new one. The first is moral hazard can decrease when the government has deep pockets, just like before. Why is that? Because, rewarding, if you do a tournament, being able to reward bank one is just as good as being able to punish bank five. And so if you have deep pockets deep enough that, say you want to engineer a merger between the bank that's doing well and the bank that's doing badly, but to do that, you need to provide some guarantees on the asset of the bad bank that's going to be purchased. Classic, that's something we do all the time. Well, if you have the fiscal space to do that, that actually is good for incentives. It's not bad for incentives because it's like a gift, but it's only a gift to the best performing bank. So that actually improves incentive upfront. If you can write down the shareholder of the bad bank to zero, that's great. Do the same with the bondholders, even better. So lesson number two, when you think about moral hazard, is that the first gen model, I think, are basically wrong. It is not a good idea, even if you worry about moral hazard, it is not a good idea to limit in a very one-sided way the kind of the funds that regulators and governments have at their disposal to fight crisis. Instead, is you want to be like, you want to impose conditions. So, for instance, there is a backstop, but this backstop is only after you run a very truthful AQR. That's a great policy. And then the distribution of losses matters just as much as the total amount of losses. See that theme coming up again and again. The total amount of money spent is not, in many cases, the right statistic to look at. Is you want to ask, did you give the money to the right people? Again, in that world, limiting the funds typically lowers welfare. What is more interesting, I guess, especially for people in the audience, is the very strong complementarity with microprudential tools. The better is your ability, the more proactive you are on PCAs. The better is your system of regulation to engineer mergers, impose losses on shareholders, engineer mergers over the weekend. The better are your micro tools, very micro, in the legal system, in the intervention, in the IT system also, by the way, same thing, even probably more important today. The better is your ability to switch turn the IT system so that they are compatible with each other, and on Monday morning the bank is running correctly. All these tools that we typically think of it as very micro issues actually turn out to be first order important when you think about moral hazard, too big to fail in, and risk management. Okay. How am I doing on time? Like 5 more minutes or something? So
maximum 5 minutes, yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So now I want to go back a little bit to deposit insurance and then open the discussion for changes going forward. So I think the trade-off of deposit insurance are very clearly understood. Protect depositors is the main thing, and then the main drawback would be to mess up incentives and create risk-taking incentives. The one I'm going to emphasize also is, based on what I said earlier, is if you have a good system of deposit insurance, that gives you more time to plan the resolution, to execute the resolution. Actually, that would be good for incentives. And in the bad side, I would say that the implicit liability for the government is first order, especially in Europe. So if you think about it in the context of the Eurozone, what does that mean or the way I think about, if I ask myself, have we done enough to avoid what we saw post-2010 in Europe? And it's a very complicated question, so I don't have a full answer for that. But the way I think about it is, first, is it literally required to have a full EU-backed deposit insurance, like very similar to what the US had? And I think the answer is probably not, actually. And I think it's somewhat hopeful because I don't think we're going to get a full EU-backed deposit insurance with joint and several liability. But I also don't think we necessarily need it. What we need is enough for two things. The first is enough to equalize funding costs across EU region in case of asymmetric shocks. The thing that was dramatic post-2010 in Europe is that we got the sign wrong. So if you have a credit crunch in a country, you want interest rate to go down. Okay. And the worse the shock, the more interest rate should go down, which is exactly what happened in the US. However, in Europe, the average interest rate went down, but the ECB doesn't control the cross-section. So, and in the cross-section, it was exactly backward, which is the worst hit country had higher money market rates. So that's exactly what you want to prevent. That's the key. So I think deposit insurance is super useful precisely to the extent it allows you to get there. But that's not the only tool to get there. And it's in this broad context that we need to think about it. That's the first point. And the second is that, of course, we don't, even if we don't, so I don't think we need a full, joint and several deposit insurance fund, but we need a backstop, obviously. We need a backstop, but the key point here is the backstop is good for incentives. Okay. And the quid pro quo is not that complicated. It's, a backstop against strong PCA and strong disclosure. And I think that's enough. Okay, now, so the lessons, I guess, are pretty clear, and I'm going to emphasize two changes, one with speed and one with market power. So speed is very much like the paper that Thomas presented earlier. Everything we discussed so far assumes that you have a minimum amount of time to intervene. Okay, and so the big question becomes, is that a good assumption? Well, in the past it was, but today, essentially it was because runs were surprisingly slow in the past. And we've been writing papers about bank run for a long time, and it's only now that they really become like runs, as in going fast. So if you can't get to the weekend, then things are different. And then the problem is that private capital is also slow moving. Okay, so so what's the implication there? I think it means that you need to be a bit more, you need to be smarter in your pre-crisis planning, and in particular, running the correct stress tests. Okay. Speed means, or speed being an issue means you need to send the money quickly. Okay, when you send the money matters, and so that means you need to be ready ahead of time, and you can't discover a big risk or pretend to discover a big risk at the last minute. So that, to me, is the key lesson from SVB. There is also more evidence of segmentation. So it's not just when you send the money, it's also where you send the money. But that is more like a two-sided coin. It's not altogether bad, because it means targeted intervention are feasible. And even though we might think of market segmentation as being sometimes annoying, I think in that case, I don't think it's necessarily that bad. But the second issue is market power and market discipline. So there is an obvious one, which is the more concentration, the more strategic behavior, and the more you're gonna, go away from what would be the right, the socially optimal outcome. But I think it actually connects to the speed issue, and that's for a reason that's also somewhat, I think, like deep in the sense that it runs across model. If you think about market power by, and not just bank, by all large financial players, it has the feature that it tends to slow down the help and speed up the risk. The more firms have market power, the more they can think strategically about when is it that I want to step in. And maybe I can just wait for the crisis to be even worse, because then the prices are going to be even lower. I can buy at faster prices. So why don't I just wait? Now, if you're in a super competitive world, that typically does not happen because somebody else is going to do it for you. But if you have a lot of market power, then that could be the right strategy. Raj and Diamond have the huge paper shows that in an example, but I think that the lesson is broader there. So the more market power, the more like private capital is going to be slow to come to the rescue. And on the other hand, it's also going to speed up the risks, because any model of anything having to do with predatory trading or predatory action against your competitors is going to increase the speed at risk crisis play out. And that's going to be even faster when there is more market power. So I think that's why this issue of market power, not just in banking, is very important when we think about crisis management. And well, okay, I'm almost on time. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Professor Philippon. It was, at times, it was a provocative lecture. Not when you, for example, mentioned that regulators can engineer mergers. Probably they can engineer mergers. But I find two things where I would like to feed back. And one is that we as regulators, we can discriminate. That is a provocative idea. And then the other thing about not the US style deposit insurance. I was considering the format of this lecture. I was equipped with questions from my side, but in order of giving the opportunity to our audience, I will not ask my prepared questions. And I will give the floor to our audience, both online and here in the room. But we will certainly remember so many thought-provoking ideas that you mentioned today. We will certainly remember the tools that you have mentioned, or as we would like to say, the combination of tools. We will certainly remember the notions of speed and market power. But I think this is a good time now to invite the audience to give questions that would be very pertinent to what you just delivered. And yes, there is one question here in the back.
Thank you for this tour de force.
I know that voice. Hello.
Hello, how are you? So I consider the mechanism that you propose is very targeted at making sure that, in a sense, you target the punishment on those that perform a moral hazard exposed, so that you have a positive effect ex ante, which saves money. And indeed, what is provocative here, and that's what the chair has already pointed out, is that it relies very much on having a very effective asset quality review, which not only would need to be precise, but it would have to stand in court. And I mean, here I'm just aware of the legal issues of differential treatment. So there is something between the intuition that we should give more power to supervisors and give it earlier, more than we do, and the fact that in practice exposed and certainly under the pressure of distress, it's extremely hard to make an assessment that would also stand in court in terms of justifying differential treatment. So perhaps the key remain what you pointed out, that you should give more power to supervisors earlier. But again, I don't know if you could literally base valuation on that.
You want me to take a few questions and answer them all at once, or?
Okay. Do we have more questions in the auditorium here? Yes, here on my right side.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Philippon, for the lecture. So, if I understood correctly, you said that moral hazard would decrease if governments have fiscal space and they commit to backstop. But what happens if we are in a world where the fiscal space is decreasing right now. So also in US, in Europe, with many countries, with also the trajectory of the public debt going very high. So what would happen in this scenario if we don't have this option? Thank you.
Okay, and in light of the remaining time that we have, I would like to invite you for one last question from the auditorium, because we currently do not have any online questions. Yes, here in the front row.
Thank you. In this very different way of looking at things that we are used to think about. So I have a question on the potential or need, or the need or not need for a European deposit insurance scheme. That's a very controversial issue in Europe, as you know, or in the in the Eurozone. But I think one criteria that you should mention on one side of the question that you should look at is the interconnectedness of our cross-border banks and how we deal with that within the banking union, because we have single supervision, you have single resolution, especially for the big cross-border banks, but you still keep the deposits under the national responsibility. A second thing is now the new neobanks, and we'll be short. The neobanks, and I give you the example of Revolut, and how you deal with that if a bank type of Revolut goes bankrupt. Who pays for the deposits? Will be the national DGS. Thank you.
Three great questions. So I have to be a little bit quick. So question one on the standing court. I fully agree. I completely agree. So I just want to say two things there. In terms of incentives, you don't need a perfect signal ex post. That is, in the picture I showed you, like I drew like five banks, and then the crisis comes, and we know who is the good guy and who is the bad guy in the crisis. But in the real world, we never know for sure. We look like this one looks like it's underperforming, this one is overperforming, but we never know for sure. That's fine. So you don't need the ex post ranking to be perfect. It just has to be informative enough. It has to be correlated with the truth. Okay, and then you get most of the benefits. But it is true that the scheme works precisely because the regulator can impose losses on the bank perceived to be the worst performing, or equivalently reward the bank that is perceived to be the best performing. Now, and that has to stand in court. Now, sometimes I think the upside, or like helping the strongest bank is a bit less controversial, because it really means in practice you have a bank that's doing well, a bank that's doing poorly. You want to make sure that the bank that's doing well can buy the bank that's performing poorly, and but to help facilitate that acquisition, you need to provide some guarantee on some first losses guarantees on the assets of the bad bank. I don't think that's very. So I think that one is not too hard to do. Now, punishing is always harder because people complain ex post. And, when you had, to me, it was like, as an economist, I never thought, after AIG, I never thought people involved in the AIG debacle could sue for anything. And the fact that they even had the, outrageous idea to sue because they thought they were mistreated, I was like, what the heck? I thought that was insane. But, unfortunately, they can always do that. And so now I think one solution to that is to have pre-positioned signals that you agree up front. So again, they don't have to be perfect. And that's also why stress tests are useful, which is you have some metric that says, well, ex post, I'm going to assess your performance, your health, according to these 10 criteria. And I'm going to, if you fail these criteria, I will go after you. If you don't, I will help you, or help you take over somebody else. If your set of criteria are published and well known ex ante. So before the crisis, I think it's much less likely to be controversial. And stress testing allows you to do that to some extent. Similarly, because if you have a scenario that says scenario XYZ, that was in the stress test, and then in this scenario you were supposed to lose 1 billion, it turned out you lost 10 billion. Well, either you're dumb or you cheated or both. In both cases, I'm allowed to tell you. But it's better if you do it, if that's well done ex ante. Question 2 was, what about fiscal space with high public debt? So that's a very tricky one. I think it plays out differently at different levels. I think if it's about funding costs and stabilizing market, it's still the central bank is the big bazooka there, and by definition, these are nominal assets, so there's no limit to what the central bank can do. So in that sense, I think we still have that. But there are other issues where the public space, the fiscal space, sorry, is more real, and to some extent, that is true. But I also think that's kind of so be it. If countries are not able to act together, they should also get some punishment for that, and so they won't be able to fight the crisis as well as if they had. So be it. And I think I speak for my country in this particular case. So it's a little bit like the next question on the EU deposit insurance scheme. We are not in the first best world. So the question is, are there trade-offs that are acceptable? To me, the trade-off that is not acceptable is what we saw in 2012 in Europe, where you have countries that are hammered by, say, some real estate or some issues, or like we saw in Spain, Portugal, or whatever. And then the funding costs in the private sector in money markets shoots up. That is not acceptable. I don't care about what the government, I don't care about anything. That is not acceptable because that's the opposite of what should happen in a well-functioning market. Now, that's the one that I think we should be very clear that is not. And I think to some extent, whereas that's the ECB is pretty clear about that. Yes. And now, if that government was dumb enough not to save money and stuff like that, they might still have to do something extremely painful for them, for their population. So be it. That's the world we live in.
Yes, Professor Philippon. With that, I think that we need to unfortunately end today, and we will come to the question of Revolut later.
Okay. It was a good question, and I'm sorry, but I just want to say I agreed with the premise that the DGS is a very tricky issue, and that cross-border banks are the sticky point. I could not agree more with that.
Yep. Look, this has been a fascinating hour that we have behind us, and I would like to thank you very much for your. Now, I would actually use these adjectives: insightful and energizing. And your input, because you combine your academic background and your real-life experience in policy advice, this is invaluable. We welcome that, and this is part of our policy work, part of our outreach. And again, let me thank you cordially. I would like to also.
It was my pleasure.
I would also like to extend gratitude to the audience here and online. And now I think it's a good time to pass the floor back to our Master of Ceremonies. And thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Radek, and thank you to Professor Philippon for being with us here today. Now, for those of you in the room, it's time for a quick coffee. We'll take about 15 minutes, and we'll be here back at just after 15:30. So thank you.